thank you, Gwen, for that very thorough introduction. I'm glad you got the most important detail from my friend Ann Coulter. I'm just going to set this to make sure I don't talk too long. Being called the stupidest journalist in America, and actually she said I was one of the stupidest journalists in America, but I think the distinction still counts. That sold a lot of books. Everybody wants to know, this is that dumb, how dumb can it be? I also, thanks to Jeffrey Bovat for bringing me here, and to my friend Dave Nathan for helping me get here and to speak with you tonight. And Jeffrey's given me a special announcement to make, which is the best announcement any author could ever be asked to make, which is that apparently for students, there's a free copy of my book. You all get a free copy of my book, and for anyone else who wants to buy one, there's a discount. So I think that's great. I hope you do too. You know a little bit about where I'm coming from as a person who's been writing about religion and increasingly politics for a long time. But there's one story in particular that I think brings me before you tonight. It's a story that I think some of you will be familiar with from last summer, when 3 Republican politicians who are all champions of what they called family values very publicly detonated their marriages. First, we had Senator John Ensign of Nevada, who at the time was the 4th-ranking Republican, either was a presidential prospect or thought of himself as one, was certainly traveling around to Iowa. Then came Governor Mark Sanford, who was an even brighter presidential prospect, who he could have been a contender, not anymore. He blew his chances when he redefined the Appalachian Trail. Some of you may remember this. He was missing, where are you? And he says, I'm on the Appalachian Trail in Argentina, where he was with his mistress. And last and least in every way was an unusually powerful but little-known congressman, or former congressman from Mississippi, Chip Pickering. Pickering, in some ways, had a bigger impact in American life than either of those two better-known men. He was one of the architects in the 1990s, as an aide, actually, to Senator Trent Lott, and then as a congressman, sort of furthering things along, of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was a massive privatization of the airwaves, basically a selling off of public property in a lot of ways, and enabled a lot of media monopolies. Some of you may have heard of Clear Channel. Clear Channel was birthed out of that. And if you ever wonder why you're in a town and you hit the button and you get one radio station, you hear a song, and you hit the next button, you hear the same song, and it's not because it's a hit, it's just because it's boring, that's media monopoly. That's the narrowing of voices and sounds that we can get from the media. Well, that was Chip's idea, but he never really got credit for that. He's better known, if he's known at all, as the congressman from Borat, the movie Borat. Some of you may have seen Borat, Cultural Learnings of America from a Benefit Glorious Nation of Kazakhstan, in which Sacha Baron Cohen, a comedian playing an idiot reporter Borat, makes his way to a revival meeting in Mississippi where Pickering takes to the pulpit to proclaim, in the most insincere terms possible, himself a loyalist to the gathering and to its truths, creationism, religious nationalism, and the idea that America is a Christian nation, created as a Christian nation and forever a Christian nation. I talked about that speaking with some very bright students today, and I find this often. I say, how many people here think, America's a Christian nation? How many people here think the Constitution makes America a Christian nation? And people always say, yeah, I think that's what it says. I was reporting at the U.S. Air Force Academy a while back, and those are students every bit as bright as you guys. Those are some of the best and the brightest. And they also thought that the Constitution declared America a Christian nation. Of course it doesn't. It's a godless document. That's not I'm not accusing it of being a godless document. It's a document without God in it. But the idea of America as a Christian nation is something that politicians have found very powerful and useful. And all 3 of these men, these philanderers, had all believed in or paid lip service to as part of the politics of fundamentalism. And I want to distinguish the politics and fundamentalism are 2 different things. There's many fundamentalist Christians who are just wonderful folks and so on, and are deep believers in democracy, but I'm talking about a certain kind of politicized religion that's something different. So they all shared that belief, but they were also united more than ideologically, because all three scandals, and why this became a story, and why it led me to sort of write a second book on this organization that I've been looking at that was behind this whole thing. They were all linked to this red brick townhouse on Capitol Hill, 133 C Street Southeast. It's across from the Library of Congress. It's a block away from one of the congressional office buildings. It's a few blocks away from the Supreme Court. It's, you know, location. It's a good location. It's called the C Street House, or as bloggers started calling it, the Prey Boy Mansion. Where all these guys were centered, all their affairs were sort of revolving around this place. And it's the headquarters, the Capitol Hill headquarters, that is, of the oldest, and as Gwen said, the most influential Christian conservative organization in America. This organization is known generally as the Fellowship, to its octogenarian leader, a man named Doug Coe, likes to call it the family. Some politicians refer to it as the Prayer Breakfast Movement in honor of the National Prayer Breakfast, which is its only public event, commonly mistaken for a public event. In fact, it's a private sectarian event with the appearance of government endorsement. So Senator Ensign, the first of these guys from Nevada, he lived in the C Street House. Governor Sanford retreated there for help in managing his wife when she started catching on to what was going on. Jenny Sanford, the advice she got was quite stunning, as she would later describe. She was told that she should never say a word in anger to her husband, that was something for men to deal with amongst themselves. And if her husband strayed from their marriage, she should take it to his brothers at C Street, and that they would be responsible for this. And then also, as a governor, as a man of great responsibility, he was under unbearable stress, and so it was incumbent upon her to never withhold sex. That was the advice that C Street gave to Jenny Sanford. Now, Congressman Pickering, last and least in every way, not only lived in C Street House, he actually rendezvoused with his mistress there, who was a telecommunications lobbyist, coincidentally, who we coincidentally then went to work for. Other residents of the C Street House, all enjoying subsidized rent by this organization in a house that's tax-free because it's registered as a church, although it fulfills none of the criteria that the IRS has laid out for what churches do. And there's a terrific group in Ohio called Clergy Voice of pastors, interdenominational, who are now pressing the case against this, saying this organization gives church a bad name. You can't have a church that the public's not allowed into, that holds no worship services, that exists for political lobbying, and in these cases, covering up these affairs. So, but they were all getting the subsidized rent, cheap rent, on Capitol Hill. And it's not just them. Some of the other folks who've cycled through the C Street House include Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina, much in the news lately as the sort of the new GOP kingmaker related to the Tea Party. Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, about to become Governor Sam Brownback of Kansas, and his soon-to-be successor in the Senate, Representative Jerry Moran, Representative Zach Wamp of Tennessee, former Representative Steve Largent, Senator Tom Coburn, the Oklahoma Republican, infamous for proposing the death penalty for abortion providers. He's also a doctor, and he played a role in the cover-up of Senator Ensign's affair. And when that came out, he tried to claim medical confidentiality because he's a doctor. It protected him from disclosing his role in the cover-up. It's worth noting that Coburn is an obstetrician. So what Ensign is going to reveal to us next is something to be there. But he also claimed that he's a deacon in his church, and so he had confidentiality under religious freedom. He's claimed his First Amendment rights. And a lot of these congressmen invoked the First Amendment, said if you ask questions about this, you're treading on our First Amendment rights. If we claim our authority comes from religion, but if you ask about that, you're infringing on our freedom of religion. I would argue it's just the opposite. You are respecting the First Amendment rights. A politician tells you that they govern from a religious place of authority, that's legitimate, and it's just as legitimate to ask questions. So that's what I've been doing with these guys for some time, going back to this period in 2003 when I sort of stumbled into the group and lived with them for a while, and then discovered that they had dumped 592 boxes of documents, memos, letters, diaries, budgets, membership rolls, everything in the Billy Graham Center archives in Wheaton, Illinois. So I moved to Wheaton, Illinois, and just sort of plugged myself into those archives for a long time, reading a history of a kind of fundamentalism that I think had been overlooked in American life. A fundamentalism that doesn't match up with what a lot of us think of as fundamentalism. It's not the pulpit pounding, Bible thumping. It's not Jerry Falwell. It's a more elite idea. It's a more sophisticated idea. And it's not public. The leader, Doug Coe, says the more invisible you can make your organization, the more influence it will have, which is true, which is why we have lobbying laws and why we have disclosure laws. The group considered registering as a lobby early on, and then in minutes of the meeting said, no, let's not do that. We'll have more influence if we don't register. That's true. But you know, so far that's kind of a conventional Washington story. It's maybe a little dirty, maybe a little nasty, but it, you know, it takes place in any number of ways. What's more interesting to me, what was more interesting to me was the nature of the influence they sought to have. I wanted to ask myself, what do they believe? So I went back in the archives and dug through this. Well, first of all, there was this, you have to go back to the very beginning, 1935, in the midst of the Great Depression, when the man who founded this movement, a man named Abraham Bahati, had what he thought was a new revelation from God. He thought God came to him one night and gave him new information. Christianity had been getting it wrong for 2,000 years. Christianity always going on about the poor, the suffering, the down and out. That's not what God wanted. God wanted him to focus on those whom he would call the up and out, the elites, the key men. Now, the poor would not be forgotten. This was to help the poor. But the best way to help the strong, or the best way to help the weak, was to help the strong. The blessings would trickle down. That if you could find key men in positions of power and turn their hearts for good. Now, this is a seductive idea, by the way. I mean, I think, give this idea its credit. If you can find the linchpin, if you can say to this, well, this governor here, if we can just change his heart, then look at all the wonderful things that will flow from that. But you then create a religious culture that is based on serving the needs of the elites rather than the needs of everybody else. That idea was combined with the particular politics of the day. They thought the Great Depression was a punishment from God for Franklin Roosevelt's policies. They would develop what some in the leadership would eventually call biblical capitalism, the idea that laissez-faire economics are actually a biblically sanctioned idea. And they would really pursue those ends. And it was an anti-labor coalition in the beginning. That was our sort of first project. But what was most unusual to me about it was its fetishization of strength. And it grows out of this movement called Muscular Christianity and the history of Christianity. This idea that the churches have been sissified. That was the language they would use. That there's too many women in the churches. That Jesus was not a wimp. Jesus was this macho guy. That inspired Bahati and some of his successors. And they took it much, much, much further. I want to read to you a quote from the current leader, Doug Coe, one of his sermons. And I want to assure you this is not an aberration. This is boilerplate. You say, hey, you know, Jesus said you got to put him before mother, father, brother, sister. Hitler, Lenin, Mao, that's what they taught the kids. Mao even had the kids killing their own mother and father. But it wasn't murder. It was for building the new nation, the new kingdom. As I said, that's not an aberration. When I lived with a group, that was a regular drumbeat. What can we learn from Hitler? And I said, I find that kind of troubling. They said, it's not the ends we admire, it's the means. I said, I find that kind of troubling. And I went back into the archives and I found these letters saying, we need more of this Hitler stuff. I found Chuck Colson, the Christian right leader, who had come to his understanding of Jesus through this organization, corresponding with Doug Coe. Just think about what a group of guys in the back of a Bavarian beer hall could do to change the world. I found video sermons. You can find this online too. We put this online through NBC News. Doug Coe saying, a model for political friendship. You're all here studying leadership. What's a good way to relate to each other? Well, let's look at what Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler did and all they were able to achieve. Now, incredibly important clarification. It's not the ends, it's the means. They're not neo-Nazis. They don't want genocide. They don't believe in any of that. They think that you can take that model of strength and turn it toward good. Well, so then the question becomes, well, what did you actually do? What did you actually do? So we go back into the archives, and we recover the history of this organization. I want to run you very quickly through just a few key dates in the organization. 1935, the formation I already told you about. 1942, having successfully elected a governor of the state of Washington, which is where it started. The movement moved to the other Washington, D.C. 1942 had about 74 congressmen summoned to hear Variety's thoughts by the head of the National Association of Manufacturers, which sounds like a kind of nondescript industry group. At that time, it was a man named Howard Coonley, who makes Glenn Beck to seem like a raving liberal. He was far, far right, and he liked this idea that his economic ideas could be given religious sanction. 1947, first legislative success when they threw their weight behind something called the Taft-Hartley Act, which was the beginning of the repeal of the New Deal. 1959, they start going international. They had caught on to the coming Cold War sooner than most. These folks are bright. These are no fools. And in 1959, two senators led a delegation of businessmen to Haiti to meet a leader that they thought was an up-and-coming prospect, someone who they could maybe arrange to throw American support for. They did. They were both on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and they became his champions. It was a guy named Papa Doc Duvalier. And I think some people in this room know that name and will shudder, and others are too young to know. Papa Doc Duvalier was an unlikely prospect for support by the Christian right, unlikely prospect to be declared a man of God, since he was quite certain that he was God. And I don't mean that in a joking way. He was a delusional, killing lunatic, perhaps the most lunatic killer in the Western Hemisphere, and there's been some competition on that score. They became his champion. 1966, a guy named Suharto came to power in Indonesia, and what the CIA, no bastion of leftist thought, would call one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. This organization, the family, called it a spiritual revolution, and began sending delegations of congressmen and oilmen who by that time had recognized the virtues of these spiritual relationships with Indonesia, one of the largest oil producers in the world, to meet with Suharto and to become his champions in Washington. I have to say, it's not an exclusively right-wing movement here. Senator Mark Hatfield, who was a sort of a liberal Republican, was particularly enamored of Suharto. When Nixon came into office, Hatfield wrote him a letter saying Suharto has indicated that he would like to use our organization as a back channel through which to communicate. And that communication carried on and on. Suharto came to power with one of the worst mass killings. Some of you may have heard of East Timor, which was another one of the genocides that happens in the 20th century after we say never again. Well, never again this time, never again this time, and so on. It goes on like that. 1983 is a moment that I focused on in my first book on this, The Family, in Somalia, where they threw their weight behind a dictator named Saad Barre, again an unlikely prospect. He described himself as a Quranic Marxist. He decorated the country with portraits of Muhammad, Marx, and himself in the middle. But he said he was willing to pray for Jesus. And in the archives of some of the most candid documents, I'm willing to pray to Jesus, was Senator Chuck Grassley, still serving from Iowa. But what I want in return is I want my defense budget doubled. I want meetings with the White House. And I want kind of a hands-off policy while I crack down on this rebel group in the North. And I pledge my loyalty to Jesus and to the United States. He wrote him a letter. He says, the Pentagon has a list of priorities of the most needed military equipment. And he got it. And he cracked down on the rebel group in the North. And the one he then discovered in the South, and the one in the West, and the one in the East, and the one in the center, until he destroyed Somalia. That country, the last moment of unity experiences when they drove Saad Barre out. And since then, it has been a country that is almost biblically ravaged. So I wrote a lot about that in the book, because it was the best documented. All the documents were there in the archive. And I tried to talk about it when I was first promoting this other book, The Family. And that was my mistake, because nobody cared. The book came out in 2008. And, got a little press. NBC News did this, all this kind of stuff. But it didn't become the political story it should have, and that's my fault. I wasn't messaging. I wanted to talk about Somalia. I remember one radio producer saying, "What's a Somalia?" So, that's, and I said, "It's this place where lots of people were killed." Oh, let's not talk about that. Then something like a miracle happened. Now, you have to understand, I went to first write about this, I went and became a member of this organization. And it has a kind of theology, some of you may understand, it's kind of got a kind of a dumbed down Calvinism. I'm not insulting it by calling it dumbed down, it's just Calvinism without the smart parts. I'm sorry. John Calvin gets a bad rap. I think he's an interesting thinker. But among other ideas was an idea of the elect, that I can't do anything to be saved, that either I am or I'm not. It doesn't really matter what I do. The family embraced that idea, and they began calling themselves the New Chosen. Within the inner circle, the understanding that the Jews, having broken their covenant with God, were no longer the chosen people. That said, I happen to be Jewish, and they knew that, and so I was double chosen. I was old chosen and new chosen, and I like to think that that's why in 2009 the book hadn't done all that great. I'm still a brother in the family of bad brothers. Senator Ensign and Governor Sanford are sitting around and said, what can we do to help Jeff? That book just hasn't gone anywhere. What can we do? And they came up with this wonderful idea of all disclosing affairs and putting this story into the public in a way that it hadn't been. So now the question wasn't what's a Somalia, it was Republican politicians caught with their pants down. That's a story the press understands. Because I do give credit where credit is due, I want to read you something from the acknowledgments. My first thanks must go to Mark Sanford, John Ensign, and Chip Pickering, who ensured that my last book, The Family, would find a second life in paperback and lead to an opportunity to follow up with his contemporary investigation. I thought about sending them flowers, but this book will have to do. So, at the time, I didn't want to write about this. Ensign had a press conference, admitted his affair. A magazine editor said, "You want to write something about that?" And I said, "No, I don't want to write anything about that. That isn't, the guy cheated on his wife. That's too bad for his family. That's not a public story." And then Mark Sanford gave a press conference that if you didn't see it, you should go watch it on YouTube. It will go down as one of the greatest displays of political theater. And I don't mean political theater insincere. That is a sincere man. Crying, weeping, talking about the Appalachian Trail, going on about the Appalachian Trail. So you're wondering, what are you going to confess? Of course, he's going to confess this affair. And then I was given an opportunity, do you want to write about this? A TV show asked me to come on and talk about it. I was like, well, I don't know. I don't want to kick this guy when he's down. It's just sad. It's just tragic. That happened to be the day Michael Jackson died. And I got bummed. That's how TV works. If something bigger than you happens, you get bummed. So I thought that was great. I thought, Michael Jackson and death had saved my soul. I didn't have to go and be this person. I didn't want to be a scold. But then Mark Sanford invoked a bit of theology. He was explaining why he wasn't going to resign. Now, he had been one of the people calling for Bill Clinton to resign. Remember when Bill Clinton had his affair? He said, you can't have an affair and govern, you got to resign. But he wasn't going to do it. Well, why was that? Well, there was some differences. See, Bill Clinton was a president. Mark Sanford was more like a king. King David, in fact, was his particular comparison. He said, I am like King David. King David sinned greatly, but then God used him and rose him up. He was referring to the story that some of you remember. King David is quite taken with a woman named Bathsheba and seduces or rapes her, depending on which biblical scholar you talk to and which translation you read, and then arranges to have her husband moved out of the picture, sent off to the front lines of the battlefield where he'll be killed. He did bad things. And so you can see where Mark Sanford's saying, if he gets excused for that, why don't I get away with this? But it was a strange bit of theology that some of us are chosen and it doesn't really matter what we do. And it drew me back into the story because it had been a central part of my first book, The Family. It had been one of the lessons that I had learned from one of the leaders of the organization, had come around to talk to a group of young men being groomed for leadership and said, why do we revere King David? And these guys didn't know. And that's a whole other story about fundamentalism and scripture literacy and the practice of reading the Bible in bits and pieces as maxims rather than text. They just didn't know. They didn't know the story very well. And so I was sort of like I was a good student. I know, because he was chosen. Why do we revere him? We don't revere him because he's a good man, because he wasn't a good man. We revere him because he was chosen. And the leader of this group is a guy named David Coe, who's the son of Doug Coe, who's also a leader of the group. He was the guy who counseled John Ensign through his cover-up of his affair. Says, yeah, interesting lesson that, chosen. He says, in terms of one young man, he says, Bo, suppose I hear you raped 3 little girls. What would I think of you? And Bo, who was a human being, said, you think I'm terrible. You think I'm a monster. And he said, no, I wouldn't think you're a monster because you're chosen. That's what being chosen means. Now, it's not that he's endorsing this, but he is arguing a kind of fringe theology, which says that morality is a human construct. We make up morals. Morality doesn't matter. As he explained, morality is for little people, for chosen leaders. For Mark Sanford, or Suharto, or Papa Doc Duvalier, a different set of rules apply. Well, because Sanford had invoked that, and because that launched the first book into kind of a different publicity, and people started coming to me, people connected with the organization, I had access that I hadn't had before. There was more of a story I wanted to tell. So I decided to go and do this this second book. And this time I really wanted, whereas that book had been about the past, I wanted to talk about the present. And I started following the money, which is what one thing journalists do. I started following the money. I said, it's not just about sex here, let's follow the money. Let's take Chip Pickering in telecommunications. Let's look at who was in this house, this C Street house. 3 or 4 congressmen at any given time who are on the telecommunications subcommittee. One leaves to become head of a big telecom lobbying association, and in that capacity is going to Chip Pickering, his brother in Christ, and these guys are doing deals. Now, this is not illegal, by the way. This is relationships. This is what they say it's about. This is one vision of leadership. They can do it. Some of the stuff does get illegal. Former Congressman Mark Siljander was one that I followed out, had become a leader in the group, had been a traditional fundamentalist and become a different kind of fundamentalist. Said he used to hate Muslims, and now he wanted to build a bridge between Christians and Muslims. It would be a one-way bridge for Muslims to become Christians. But he said they didn't have to call themselves Christians, and in fact they should not call themselves Christians, because if they call themselves Christians they can't get elected, and then they can't do the work of Christ in their country. So they should continue to call themselves Muslims. Some of his friends he befriended this way, they weren't quite ready to do that, but he was willing to work for them. He pled guilty this past July to obstruction of justice and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign power, being Sudan. And the leader there, Omar Bashir, who he claims melted his heart with his kindness. Omar Bashir is the first sitting head of state to be indicted for genocide in Darfur. Siljander had an answer for that too. Things got a little out of hand in Darfur, but let's not go crazy with sanctions. If we keep doing business with this man, we can incentivize him to stop the killing. This played out, I found, over and over and over again. Senator Tom Coburn in Lebanon, Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, one of the most candid, because whereas most of the men were saying, oh, the C Street House is just a spiritual place, it's not me, I hold political meetings there. He says, when I'm promoting this, he says, I travel to promote the political philosophy of Jesus as taught to me by Doug Coe. The political philosophy of Jesus, in the case of Sonny Abacha, the dictator of Nigeria, another oil-rich country, with Senator Inhofe, winner of Lifetime Petroleum Service Awards, and a great champion of no sanctions on Nigeria, no sanctions on Abacha, as he took one of the greatest thefts in African history. Now, these guys, it's not that they go out looking for criminals to work with. And there's certainly a Christian tradition, you know, that Jesus sat down with the tax collectors and the prostitutes, and they invoke that. But there's a difference between the prostitutes, those who in fact have been pushed into a position by being weak in society, and the strong. There's a difference between going to someone like Sonny Abacha, and if you want to, you know, be a missionary on your own time, not on the government dime. It's important to know that Senator Inhofe has charged Tulsa, Oklahoma, did investigation, newspaper down there, at least $187,000 of taxpayer money for specifically what he said were Christian missions to foreign heads of state, and he used his office. Why this guy is still in office, I don't know, but if we have Oklahomans here, maybe they can tell us something about that. But there was no sense within the organization, they don't think they're doing anything wrong. And it reminded me of my first days as a reporter. I was in San Diego. And I like San Diego, but to understand the political climate of San Diego, it helps understand that Nixon called it his lucky town. There's one, when I was covering politics there, you don't run under parties. There's just one party, and the idea that that way we'll avoid some of the rancor and we'll just have one big, blindingly corrupt party. And I was speaking to a city councilwoman who was also a lawyer involved in a stadium deal. And I was 20 at the time. I said, isn't that a conflict of interest? And she looked at me and in all sincerity said, what do you mean? She couldn't even imagine the conflict of interest. That's what's happened at C Street, where we've reached a point where piety and corruption are not at odds, they're one and the same. Not to say that piety is inherently wrong, but the corruption, the very corruption is understood as a form of piety. When Senator Tom Coburn arranges for payments to help Senator Ensign cover up his fare, he sees that as an expression of love for his brother. And he says love for a brother is important. Well, you know what? When you're a politician, your loyalty to your brother is less important to your loyalty to us, right? That's obvious. We all know that. They've lost hold of that. And that's the kind of fundamentalism I've tried to describe. I mainly write about it in C Street in the book. I also write about it in the military, where I encountered, traveled all over, spoke to military personnel in every service, every rank, generals who would tell me that their duty overseas was to represent not America, but Christ. Well, that's problematic, and it becomes more problematic in the case of one young man who took a Bradley fighting vehicle, special forces in Samara, and they were surrounded, and they had their translator paint on the side in big red Arabic letters, Jesus killed Muhammad. And they drove it through the streets of Samara. And anyone who took a shot at them, and people did, you can imagine, they turned the guns on. They blew up. And the driver said he destroyed an entire civilian block. And I said, how did you do it? How did you do this? And he misunderstood my question. He thought I was asking how come he didn't get hurt. And he said that he was spiritually armored because the chaplain had provided him a special screening of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, and that had given him his marching orders that day. That's the sort of the dark end of where this can be. I want to end with the long shadow of C Street. In America, we're talking about, there's a Justice Department investigation going on into this right now, into the C Street scandals and so on. But we're talking about nobody's getting hurt, nobody's getting killed. But let's follow that money out. Let's follow those relationships out into other countries where these guys seek influence, where they represent American power. And I want to talk about Uganda, which is where I ended up doing a lot of my reporting for this new book. Uganda, most people don't realize, is quite an important country in the United States. We've given them billions of dollars of aid. It is our, depending on how you want to put it, our staunch ally or our proxy in the region, is fighting a brave war against terror in Somalia, or as most Somalis, most Ugandans describe to me as a mercenary war. They're doing this for American aid. We need them. They've also discovered a lot of oil, so there's some interest there too. But what I want to talk about is a particular piece of legislation, something called the Anti-Homosexuality Act. This is a piece of legislation, and regardless of your views on homosexuality, I hope everyone in this room will agree that this is a no-brainer. This bill is probably a bad idea. Death penalty for repeat offenders if you have gay sex more than once. One-time life imprisonment. What I'm doing right now, talking to you about it, that's called promotion. That's 7 years. I was with a Ugandan journalist colleague who happened to be very anti-gay himself, and he asked the member of parliament proposed is what if I talked about homosexuality on the air and I just didn't take a position on it? And he said, no, you'd go to prison. If there is anybody in this room who is gay and you know about it and you don't report it in 24 hours, 3 years in prison. And it doesn't matter if it's your brother, sister, mother, father. It is the most draconian anti-gay bill in the world. It's not passed into law yet. That's part of the good news. I got interested in this because Uganda had been a very important country for this organization, and in the book I sort of tell the whole story of their relationship going back to 1986 when the current leader came into power, then a promising guy, now a dictator, 24 years later. That's kind of a safe guess. He's still there. But the man who wrote this bill, Member of Parliament David Bahati, well, he was the de facto leader of what you might call the Ugandan C Street. They had established a similar group of politicians in the Ugandan parliament. They met once a week. I asked him if there was a connection between this and the bill, between the family and the bill, and he says the bill is the family. It's what we do. Now, this upset a lot of the Americans who were involved in this because they don't support this. Even the most anti-gay of them, Senator Jim Inhofe, who took to the floor of the Senate with a picture of his kids, grandkids, and says, "I want everybody in the Senate to know that there are no homosexuals in my family." Okay, thanks. This is a little bit like his fellow C Streeter, Senator Tom Coburn, who campaigned some years ago claiming that he had a list of bathrooms, women's bathrooms in southeast Oklahoma where he knew lesbian activity to be taking place, which raised the question, how do you know that, Senator Tom Coburn? What are you doing in those bathrooms? But even these guys said, this is awful. This is awful. And so do we say, okay, great, they say it's awful, they bear no responsibility? Or do we follow the money, the millions of dollars into which this organization has funneled into Uganda over the last 10 years for leadership development, the regular visits that Senator Inhofe has taken to Uganda on our dime to talk about the moral decay of America and how Uganda has a chance to be the bright light of the future? Or do we talk about David Bahati, this member of parliament who got a start in politics by coming to Arlington, Virginia to study at something called the Leadership Institute, which introduced him to the family? To friends, he said, like Mitch McConnell and John Ensign. He knew these men. There is a distinction between them. The Americans like to say, we didn't kill anybody in Uganda. We didn't pull the trigger. I think when we look at it systemically, they didn't pull the trigger. They built the gun. They created the institution. They created something that was ready to be weaponized. And the question is, what did they do to stop it? I want to close with a passage from the book that maybe shows a little bit what's at stake. Because most of what I did is I went and spent some time with David Bahati, getting to know him. It was important because a lot of American apologists are saying, oh, this bill doesn't really have the death penalty. No, it does. They write down their bills too. It's a text, we can see it. They say, oh, it's not really that draconian. I asked David Bahati, I said, if you could kill all the gay people in Africa, would you do it? He sighed, he says, yes, but it's not a perfect world. We live in a democracy, so he's going to start with Uganda. Let me flip that script to see a little bit what it feels like on the other side. This is a story of a person named Victor Juliet Mikasa, and a lawsuit, Victor Mikasa and Yvonne Oyu versus Attorney General in 2007. Victor Mikasa was a trans man, born female, living male, interested in girls. And as a child, Juliet Mikasa, as she was known, knew she was attracted to children of the same sex. And she'd been raised Catholic, but had joined an American-style Pentecostal church, hoping that in the music and the dancing and the Holy Ghost, the ecstasy, she would find the resolution of her desires. But Juliet Mikasa was not so skilled at leading two lives. She dressed as Victor. She couldn't think dressed like a girl. A pastor determined that she was possessed by a male spirit and asked his flock to help him heal her. The exorcism took place at the altar in front of 1,000 self-professed Christians, boys and men from the church's healing ministry, laying on hands and speaking in tongues as women in the pews swayed and sang for Mikasa's liberation, as the pastor called it, her freedom. They took her arms, gently, then firmly, and then they held her and stripped her, slowly, garment by garment, praying over each piece of demonically infused cloth. She had bound her breasts. They bared them. I cried, and every time I cried, they would call it liberation. They slapped her, but it was holy slapping, and when she stood before them completely naked, the men's hands roaming over her body and then inside, they said that was holy too. And then they locked her in a room and raped her for a week. This is known as a corrective, a medical procedure, a cure. When it was all over, the pastor declared that the church had freed Mikasa, and maybe in a sense it had. Victor Mikasa no longer believed there was a demon inside him. He believed that the demons were in that church. Mikasa became a man and an activist, determined to prevent what happened to him from happening again. In 2003, he founded an LGBT rights organization, Freedom in Rome, Uganda. In 2005, Ugandan police, led by government officials, raided his house. They didn't find Mikasa, but a friend, Yvonne Oyo, was there. They took her down to the station. They stripped her. You look like a man, they said. We're going to prove you're a woman. It happened again. Mikasa fled. But in hiding and then in exile, he planned. The plan wasn't lesbian, it wasn't gay, it was human. It was a citizen's plan. Mikasa sued, and never was a lawsuit more like a gift of the spirit, the romance of the rule of law. The only happy ending in this story is they won the lawsuit. In a country where the idea of genocide has been set on simmer, they still believe in due process. You can kill gay people, but you must do it legally. You can't kick down doors without a warrant. Mikasa won. He lives in South Africa now. People are fleeing Uganda. Most of the people I met when I was there are already gone. One man's in the Netherlands. Another woman on the run from pretty much everyone in her life is at Episcopal Seminary in Boston. It's worth noting that almost all the gay activists are deeply devout Christians, what many of us would probably consider fundamentalists, but for this issue of sexuality and how to respond to it. But there are also citizens in Uganda, and I think there's a happy ending in that story of Victor Mikasa. And in the way I try to end the book, I decided to end the book, people say, well, what can we do about this? And you know, I like Mikasa's response. He's a Christian. So many of the other gay activists I met there were Christians. I like that response because they were claiming their citizenship as believers, as people in this relationship. They were also wanting to know about the American connections that was funding this stuff that was going on. But you know, we can take that same response here. I end the book, I didn't want to end it with very strict separation of church and state, a solution that's never worked. You know, people, another talk I was giving said, do you have any hope for America as a secular nation? Absolutely not, because it never has been. It's not a secular nation because a lot of people who live here, who are citizens, who have as much right to their ideas, don't experience it as such. But it is a democratic nation, and there is a democratic tradition within fundamentalism. And so I ended the book with a fundamentalist street preacher who I happen to know and like, who happens to be very conservative, but I met him when I was reporting about the 2004 Republican convention. He was marching in protest of the Republicans whom he was going to vote for. It was confusing for him like that. I asked him what he was there for. He said he wanted to give God a voice. He said, God doesn't have a voice. He said, no, I want to give God a voice in the crowd. I want to be representing God in this march. One more voice, just one more voice, a part of the crowd, a citizen, a part of the democracy. What James Buchanan, one of the worst presidents in American history, and his perhaps sole contribution to American thought, he said, I like the noise of democracy. I like the noise of disagreement, of argument. That's what's sacred. That's what's sacred in the fundamentalist tradition. That's what's sacred in the democratic tradition. That's what C Street erases. That's what people like Victor Mikasa and my friend out on the streets marching in protest, that's what they reclaim. And that is, I hope, the solution to the numbing religion of C Street, which is, I believe, the fundamentalist threat to democracy. I'll stop there and you talk about what you want.